I was 24 when this happened, living in northern Minnesota at the time, and I remember that night clearer than anything else in my life. Back then, I didn't think much about danger. I worked long shifts at a small auto shop, kept to myself, and spent most of my weekends doing the same routine I always did: drive out to the lake, grab groceries, then head back home before the roads iced over. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. Just a simple winter life in a quiet part of the country. That night started exactly the same way. It was a Friday in late January, and the temperature had dropped fast once the sun went down. The kind of cold where your breath hangs in the air like smoke and the snow beneath your boots turns stiff and glassy. I remember leaving the gas station around 6 p.m. with a hot coffee in one hand and a couple of things for dinner in a small paper bag. The sky was already dark, but that's normal up there in the winter. People don't linger outside long, anyway. You get in your truck, you go home, you lock up, and you stay warm. I wasn't thinking about anything except how tired I was. I had spent the whole day working under a Jeep in the shop's unheated bay, and all I wanted was food, a shower, and maybe a movie if I stayed awake long enough. The drive home was quiet, the kind where the road looks like a frozen ribbon stretching endlessly ahead. The only lights were the tall pines sliding past the headlights and the occasional reflector nailed into a post. It should have felt peaceful. It usually did. But something was off that night, and I didn't realize it until later. When I pulled into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was how dark the house looked. Normally, I left at least one hallway light on since winter storms made the power flicker a lot. But everything was black. I figured the breaker tripped, or the storm knocked something loose. It wasn't a big deal, just annoying. What got my attention, though, was the snow. There was a single line of footprints across my yard. Not mine. Not from the day before. Fresh, clean edges, no drift, no melting. They started near the tree line across from my house, cut straight across the yard, and stopped near my front steps. Just stopped. No return tracks.
No wandering. No hesitation.
One direct path from the woods to my door. I remember standing there in the cold, holding my coffee, trying to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe a delivery person got the wrong house. Maybe a hunter cut through my yard. Maybe kids were messing around. But the more I studied the prints, the more I realized something that made the back of my neck go tight. Those footprints were big.
Heavy.
Deep, like the person barely lifted their feet. And I had no idea who they belonged to. My house back then sat at the edge of a long, narrow road that branched off the main highway. It wasn't anything special, a small one-story place with wood siding, a metal roof, and a porch that always creaked in the wind. The nearest neighbor was about a quarter-mile away, hidden behind trees, so thick you couldn't see their house even in the summer. That kind of spacing is normal in northern Minnesota. People like their privacy, especially in winter when the days get short and the woods feel heavier than usual. The area was quiet in a way most people from the city don't understand. No traffic. No stores.
No voices.
At night, all you hear is the wind pushing through bare branches and the occasional crack of ice shifting on the lake behind the property. The snow piles up fast out there, and once the plows finish for the evening, the road becomes a white tunnel with no real edges. You get used to it. It becomes routine. Winter dictates everything. That Friday night, the air felt colder than usual. The kind of cold that makes the boards on the porch snap and pop even when no one's walking on them. When I stepped inside, I noticed immediately that the house had that sharp, metallic chill that only happens when the power's been out for a while. The lights didn't turn on, and the heater wasn't running. I checked the thermostat just to confirm I wasn't imagining it. It was off. Completely dead. At first, I didn't think much of it. Power outages aren't rare in that part of the state. All it takes is one heavy wind, and the lines freeze up. I set my groceries down in the kitchen and grabbed the flashlight I kept in a drawer by the sink. I figured I'd check the breaker box and then call the utility company if it looked serious. My dog, Max, usually greeted me the second I came home. He was a 4-year-old black lab with more energy than sense, always excited, always bouncing around. But that night, he didn't meet me at the door. I didn't hear his collar shake. I didn't hear him breathing or scratching at the floor. I called him once, then again, and finally heard his toenails clicking from the far end of the hallway. When he appeared, his tail wasn't wagging. He stayed behind me instead of running past to sniff the groceries. His ears were low, and he kept glancing at the front window like he expected something to be there. I had never seen him act like that, but I tried not to jump to conclusions. Animals pick up on storms before we do, and I assumed maybe the pressure drop or the cold made him uneasy. I put on my jacket and boots again and stepped back outside to check if the outage was area-wide. The sky had that heavy, gray look that means more snow is coming. Everything was still. No cars. No sound. Just the long stretch of my yard, the silent woods beyond it, and those same deep footprints leading straight to my porch. At the time, I tried to treat it like just another winter inconvenience. I was tired. I was hungry. And I had no idea the night was about to get worse. I walked around the house with my flashlight, trying to figure out if the outage was just mine, or if the whole stretch of road was down. The snow was falling harder now, drifting sideways in the wind, and the cold bit through my jacket fast. I checked the power line that connected to my house, but there was nothing obviously wrong with it. No branches on it. No ice chunk pulling it down. Everything looked normal. But Max wouldn't come off the porch. He usually followed me everywhere, but he just stood by the door, stiff, staring toward the tree line again. I called him once, but he didn't move. He wasn't whining or barking, just silent, focused. That bothered me more than anything. Labs don't stay quiet when something's wrong. They make noise. They warn you. This silence felt different. When I walked back inside, the house felt even colder. Not just physically cold, but empty in a way I couldn't explain. I kept telling myself the power outage was making me overthink it. A quiet house in winter feels different. But still, something was off. As I moved through the hallway, the floorboards made a soft creaking sound under my boots. Normal for an older house. But when I stopped walking, the creaking didn't stop right away. It continued for a second longer, like someone else had taken a step in sync with mine and was just slightly behind me. I stood completely still, listening. Nothing moved. The house stayed silent. I felt the hair on my arms lift, even through the jacket. I went to the breaker box in the small utility room and opened it. All the switches looked normal. Nothing flipped. Nothing burnt. I reset the main breaker anyway, but the house stayed dark. I was about to call the power company when I heard something faint from the living room. A soft shuffle, like fabric brushing against fabric. I turned off the flashlight for a second just to listen clearly. Max growled low from the hallway. Not loud, not aggressive. Just a quiet warning rumble from deep in his chest. He only growled like that when someone walked past the yard, or when he sensed a stranger nearby. The problem was, no one should have been anywhere near the house at this hour, especially not with the snow coming down this hard. I turned the flashlight back on and moved slowly toward the living room. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the furniture, the empty couch, the coffee table. Nothing out of place. But the room felt wrong. Like someone had just been there a moment earlier and stepped away before I entered. A cold draft moved across my legs. Not from the door. I had closed it tight. Not from the windows, they were all locked. It came from deeper in the room, almost like air shifting around someone walking. I stood there for a long moment, listening, trying to convince myself I was hearing the house settle or the wind slipping in through a crack. But the longer I stood there, the more certain I became that I wasn't alone in that dark, silent room. Something or someone had been moving inside my house before I walked in. I tried to stay logical, even though my nerves were tightening with every second of silence. Houses make noises. Wind travels through gaps. Cold wood shifts. I repeated those excuses in my head while I checked the windows one by one. Every latch was still locked. Every curtain was still undisturbed. Nothing appeared broken or forced. But Max wouldn't leave the hallway. He stood rigid, staring toward the living room like he was waiting for something to step out. His ears were back, and his breathing was slow and tense. I'd never seen him act that way, not even during thunderstorms. I finally decided to check outside again. If someone had entered the house, I would have seen tracks around the back windows or the side door. I turned toward the porch, but halfway there, I froze. The doorknob on the front door moved.
Just a tiny, slow turn.
Like someone was testing it from the outside. My first instinct was that maybe the wind pushed it, but the movement was too controlled, too deliberate. I didn't make a sound. I just stood still, listening. The metal clicked again, slightly sharper this time, like a careful hand tightening around it. Max let out another low growl, deeper than before. I stepped back. My heart started beating harder, not fast, just heavy. I waited for a knock or a voice, anything that would make sense. But there was nothing. After a few seconds, the knob stopped moving completely. The silence that followed felt even louder than the clicking. I shut off my flashlight and moved away from the front door, keeping my steps as quiet as possible. If someone was out there watching the windows, I didn't want to give them a clear view of where I was standing. I reached the kitchen and crouched behind the counter, listening to the house breathe around me. That's when I heard the snow crunch outside the side window, slow, dragging steps circling the house. One step.
Pause.
Another step. A longer pause. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen stayed black.
Dead.
It must have shut off in the cold, or maybe I left it on too long without charging. Either way, I had no signal, no power, no light except the fading beam of my flashlight. And I had no idea how long the person outside planned to stay. The footsteps moved to the back of the house. I heard them brush against the siding, slow and steady. Then 3 soft taps on the rear window. Not knocking, just a test. Like they were checking how thick the glass was. I moved to the hallway, keeping one hand on Max's collar, so he wouldn't bolt forward. He was shaking now, not from fear but from tension, ready to react. Then, the worst sound of the night happened. The back door handle began to rattle. Hard. Not a test this time. Someone was trying to open it, pulling and twisting with enough force to make the frame pop. That's the moment it hit me. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding, no random passerby. Someone was actively trying to get inside my house. The back door shook again, harder this time. The hinges let out a strained metallic groan, and I could hear the frame tapping against the lock with each pull. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to scare me anymore. They were trying to break in. The cold from the draft hit my face as I backed away, pulling Max with me. My breathing felt tight, like my chest didn't have enough room for air. I needed somewhere to hide. The house wasn't big, and every room had a window except the small pantry near the kitchen. It wasn't ideal, but it had a solid door and no direct view from outside. I grabbed my flashlight, held Max by the collar, and moved fast but quiet through the hallway. Then I heard the back door lock snapping. A quick, sharp crack. The sound of metal giving way. I didn't look back. I pushed Max into the pantry and stepped inside behind him, closing the door slowly to avoid the loud click. I didn't lock it. The sound would have given me away. I pressed my shoulder against the door and listened. The house went silent for a moment. Then soft footsteps entered from the kitchen. One footstep. A pause. Another footstep. They were inside. No doubt. I could hear the weight of each step on the old wooden floor. I gripped the flashlight tighter, but I kept it off. Any beam under the door would give away my hiding spot. Max pressed against my leg, trembling hard. He wasn't whining, he seemed to understand that noise meant danger. I rested one hand on his back, but even that small movement felt too loud. My own heartbeat sounded like it was echoing inside the tiny pantry. The footsteps moved through the living room first, slow and heavy, like the person was scanning the area. Then they came toward the hallway. Boards creaked one by one. I could picture them standing just outside the pantry, trying to listen the same way I was. Then the footsteps stopped right in front of the door. I froze.
Max froze.
Neither of us moved. The doorknob turned a little. Not fast, slow.
Testing.
Feeling. I held my breath until my lungs hurt. The knob turned again, farther this time, but I kept my shoulder pressed against the door. If I let it swing even a fraction, they'd know. They'd push harder. They'd force their way in. The knob twitched once more. Then silence. 5 seconds. 10 seconds.
20.
Nothing. I didn't know if they had stepped away or were still inches from the door, waiting to catch movement or noise. I stayed completely still. Then, suddenly, something clattered in the living room, a loud, stumbling crash, followed by quick, aggressive movement. I heard the intruder rushing toward the front door. Then it slammed open, banging against the wall. Max barked once, sharp and explosive. I waited another full minute before I even breathed. When I finally cracked the pantry door open, the living room lights flickered on. The power had returned. The front door was wide open. Cold air rushed in. Snow blew across the floor. The intruder was gone. But the worst part wasn't that he escaped. It was what he left behind. Something dropped on the floor near the doorframe. A long, dark winter glove, and fresh blood on the wood. I stared at the glove and the smear of blood for a long time before I even moved. The house was lit again, but that didn't make me feel any safer. Max kept pacing in small circles, sniffing the floor, growling under his breath at the open doorway. The cold air pouring in made the whole place feel exposed, like the walls weren't protecting me anymore. I knew I needed to call the police before the intruder got too far. My phone had turned back on when the power returned, so I grabbed it and dialed 911. The dispatcher told me to stay inside, lock every door, and wait for the nearest patrol, though it could take 30 to 40 minutes because of the storm. I hung up and locked the front door, then double-checked every other lock in the house. Only after the immediate panic settled did I take another look at the glove. It wasn't just any glove. It was a thick, insulated winter glove, black with a gray lining, and it looked worn, like someone had used it for years.
But there was something else about it.
Something that made me feel sick the moment I noticed. There was a small patch sewn onto the side, a faded yellow square with a number written in permanent marker. 14A. I didn't recognize it at first, but the more I stared, the clearer the memory became. A few years earlier, during one of the coldest winters I'd seen, a group of seasonal workers stayed at a temporary winter shelter just outside town. The county assigned numbers to their clothing so they could keep track of issued gear. My friend, Mark, worked there as a part-time volunteer. I had helped him move some supplies once. I remembered seeing gloves, hats, and coats laid out on long metal tables. Every item had numbers written on small patches, including 14A. The county closed that shelter almost 2 years ago. Most of the workers moved on. A few stayed in town. A few disappeared into the woods. And one of them, apparently, had been inside my house tonight. That realization alone was bad. But something else hit me even harder, the clarity of the footprints outside. They were steady, deep, and direct. Whoever this person was, he wasn't disoriented. He wasn't wandering. He walked straight from the woods to my door, like he already knew where I lived. I checked the back door to see how he broke in. The lock was snapped clean, but the door frame wasn't damaged the way it should have been if someone used brute force. It looked like the lock itself had been manipulated, pushed inward with something thin and strong. Not random. Not desperate. Skilled. That's when it clicked. A few workers from that shelter had been arrested in the past for breaking into remote cabins during winter. They knew how to slip locks. They knew how to move quietly. They knew which homes were isolated. But the scariest part wasn't who he was. It was what I found next. When I checked my bedroom window, the one facing the woods, I saw faint handprints on the glass. Not from tonight. Older. Frozen imprints from previous nights. He had been watching my house long before he ever tried to get inside. The police arrived just after midnight. 2 deputies stepped into the house, melting snow dripping from their jackets, the same quiet seriousness on both of their faces as I explained what happened. They checked every room, walked the perimeter of the house, and studied the footprints leading back toward the woods. One deputy followed the tracks with his flashlight cutting across the snow, but the trail faded less than 50 yards into the trees. The storm had already started covering everything again. They took the glove, took photos, and told me they'd file a report. The older deputy, Peterson, asked if I had any enemies or knew anyone who might want to scare me. I told him no. I told him about the shelter, the worker programs, and the numbered gear. He nodded slowly, like he'd heard something similar before. But then he said something I didn't expect. "We've had a few break-ins reported this winter," he told me. "Remote houses only. No forced entry. Same kind of footprints. Whoever it is, they watched the place for a while first." That alone made my stomach twist, but what he said next stayed with me long after the night was over. "They pick the houses where the owner lives alone." After they left, I locked every door and window again, checked each room twice, and kept Max close. The house felt too quiet now, too open. The wind pressed against the siding like someone brushing their hands along the walls. Every creak made me jump. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing those older handprints on the glass, the ones from nights before. I kept wondering how many times I had been inside, asleep or distracted, while someone stood only inches away on the other side of thin glass, watching me, waiting. The next morning, I found something new. Out near the edge of the yard, right where the footprints had first appeared, the snow looked disturbed in a way I hadn't noticed before.
Not footprints this time.
Just a long, shallow depression, like someone had been lying there
For a long time.
The snow beneath was pressed down, hardened from weight.
I didn't tell the police about that. I don't know why.
Maybe I didn't want to hear their theories. Maybe I didn't want them to confirm what I already feared, that the intruder hadn't just come to my door. He had been camping out there, watching, studying my routine, waiting for the right night, the right moment, the right outage. For the next few weeks, I changed everything. I bought better locks, installed cameras, boarded the back window, kept lights on every night, slept with Max at the door. But even with all of that, I never felt like the danger was gone. A month later, the sheriff's office called to tell me they still hadn't found anyone connected to my break-in.
No suspects. No sightings.
Nothing. The glove didn't match any records. The tracks led nowhere. The person simply vanished. And now, even though winter is long over and the snow has melted, I still catch myself looking toward the tree line every night before I go to bed. Sometimes the shadows between the branches look too still.
Sometimes I think I hear footsteps in the...
And sometimes when the wind hits the windows just right, I swear it sounds like a gloved hand brushing across the glass. The scariest part? I never found any new footprints. But I also never found any from the night he left.